today is to continue to talk about this shift between minimalism to what's oftentimes referred to as post-minimalism. And we're going to start seeing this word post. Yeah, did I short you one? Oh, sorry, I'm always shorting. You need another comment? You need two, one, okay. And then two in the back. Just one in the back. Okay. Because what happens is we look at a time frame and the way language develops to talk about what's going on, we see modernism developing in the later part of the 19th century. It goes through, as you look at it in the 19th century, that's sort of the first iteration. It really begins to shift as you come into the 20th century, and that's sort of like the second iteration. Then there's what's sometimes referred to as high modernism or mid-century modernism. And that's obviously, mid-century, so around the 1950s or so. And then as you move forward, especially getting on into the 1970s, and certainly here in the late 60s, there's another kind of shift that seems to occur. And next week, we'll be talking more specifically about postmodernism and what postmodernism means. So one of the things about the 20th century is that as you kind of look at how we move through time, it's mostly a modernist period, but then closer to the end of the century, and again, the transition time is a little fuzzy because it depends on what you're looking at. If you're looking at architecture, there's a certain beginning point that's pretty early. If you're looking at artwork, there's that beginning point that is a little bit later, closer into the 1980s and even the 1990s as well. But there's a sense that there's a kind of shift that's occurring where artists are doing something different, and there's not really a good word for it. And so what happens is you begin to see post-whatever, So there's minimalism and then post-minimalism. There's modernism and then post-modernism as well. So there's a tendency to name things in a sense by what they're not, like what they're related to, but what they're not. And that's essentially what's happening here. So as we look at this first work by Eva Hesse, she's often described as being a post-minimalist artist. And I think looking at these two works side by side is a good, sort of a good introduction to some of these ideas. So if we think about minimalism, one of the things that are common with minimalism is this idea of the square, of this a repetition of form of a basic geometric form, and you kind of can't come up with a more basic geometric form than a square or a cube in this respect. For minimalists, although there's certainly two-dimensional variations of minimalism, you can think of Sella as a good example. So there's a minimalist painting, but minimalism really is best known in terms of its 3D, iterations or sculpture. And so there's this idea that minimalist installations or minimalist sculpture, it's not about the objects, but it's about the way they displace space and how you interact with that space. And then some other things we've seen with minimalism too, these ideas of repetition as well. We can think of Agnes Martin and those gridded paintings, so this repetition of form with squares, essentially repeated. So we can see a lot of those things at play in Eva Hesse's work, but suddenly it's shifted and there's something different going on with this work. And I'm curious, as I've been talking and you've been looking at this image, how do you respond to this work? Like, what are your initial thoughts about it? What's that? Who said that? Yeah, make sure you're comfortable. Well, make sure I'm comfortable about it. Yeah, because it's open, right? Yeah. Yeah. A reverse hedgehog, right? It's like folded in on it, so yeah.
Do a handstand?
For my
Yeah. Yeah. And I always ask this question before I talk about it too much, because the first time I saw an image of this work, I had a response more like Harris's. Because I was thinking about minimalism and steel, right? And iron and steel. And what we're seeing here is the box is made out of panels of sheet metal that have been drilled with holes, basically like in a grid pattern. And then, but the first time I saw this work, and also because I saw it in reproduction, I didn't see it in person. Had I seen it in person, I think I would have reacted differently to it. But what I saw on the inside, I thought was also metal, right? And so it struck me as, seeing me kind of aggressive, like kind of like shark's teeth or something, something like that. But it's actually rubber tubing. So it's black rubber tubing, right? Right. So it's almost kind of like hair in a way. So when you said hedgehog, it's maybe more hedgehog-like in a way. And the way it's constructed is the panel, is drilled with holes, and it's just equal lengths of rubber tubing that are inserted, one piece to two holes. So they're almost like kind of like follicles in that respect. And so that has a whole different read on it, right, than if it's this aggressive kind of steel construction. And the other interesting thing about this work too, the title of it is called Accession 2. And the reason for that is this is the second one that she built. The first one, when it was exhibited, and to give you a sense of this will give you a better sense of the scale of it too. The first one that she exhibited, somebody crawled inside of it and accidentally broke it. They didn't intend to do that, but when they crawled into it, I think it popped it apart. And that's always struck me as really interesting, because what it means is when somebody experienced this piece, their immediate response was to kind of get into it, right? Kind of tactile experience. So this is the second version of it to replace that first version. Yeah, Brandon, did you have a question or thought?
It's a weird relation, but when I see it, because it has like this, this open. You were talking about crawling inside of it. I don't know why, but did you ever see the movie The Labyrinth with David Bowie?
Oh, of course.
And when she's inside like the tunnel full of all the hands that are looking at her,
yeah.
I get that sort of feel from it. Like if I was inside of it, like even though they're soft, they might hold me back from coming back out.
Yeah, maybe it's still a little frightening at the same time. Yeah, that's interesting because they're kind of angled down as well. Yeah, so I think, and this is the kind of thing where you sort of bring your own personal experiences to it, in terms of how you react to it, whether it's a more positive, kind of reaction or something, more negative or more of a concern, maybe in some respects. But Eva Hesse was really notable, and I think this is a good example, of how she takes these really kind of, hard, regular geometric forms that were so associated with minimalism, and then pushes them toward a more organic kind of conclusion, in a sense. And we'll also see this in some of her other works. The other thing, too, about Hesse is that when you look at, I didn't bring it in, but when you look at her really early work, the work especially she was doing when she was a student, she was a painter, and it looks a lot like a lot of abstract expressionism. So she kind of, and that's a pattern for a lot of artists around this time period. They kind of start as abstract expressionists, and they move in a different direction. And in this case here, when she's really coming into her own as an artist, minimalism is this kind of new hot thing, and she's kind of taking this idea of minimalism and also pushing it into a new and different direction. The other thing, there are other material that she was also working with was unusual for the time too. And when you think of minimalism, oftentimes it's industrial materials, especially kind of cast off industrial materials, and so we think of like metal and steel and concrete and those kind of things. And she began working with latex and fiberglass. And so what we're looking at here is a piece that's made out of it's a kind of latex rubber. But again, it's got, in a formal sense, it's very minimalist, right? We've got this flat plane with this repetition of these circular forms and these kind of very grid-like patterns. But the reason she was really interested in the latex was because it's soft like skin. It has this kind of rubbery kind of quality to it. Depending on how you work with it, there's even a kind of translucency to it as well. So it's a material that feels very organic. So what she's doing with work like this is really playing with this kind of tension. So on one hand, you've got this very geometric, regular, kind of repetition of forms in a very kind of hard-edged kind of way, and yet the materials themselves are literally soft. So just kind of playing with those side by side. This is another example of one of her pieces. It's called Repetition 19. There are 19 forms, and these are made out of and these particular ones, they're resin and fiberglass. I think it's the two together. So they're actually pretty rigid and hard. And I wish I had a better photograph than this one here. I've come across some other photos, and the color's better, but the resolution isn't better. So I need to find out where this is on display and just go there and take pictures of it, I think. But the thing about this installation is it's infinitely modular. And so maybe we can see some kind of, silhouette, kind of thinking here. Because they're 19 forms and they can be arranged in any particular way. And it might depend on the space that they're in, whether there's lots of space or a little space. Do you want them all clustered together in a tight form? Do you want to spread them out within that space? And they also have a very organic quality to them. They almost look like beeswax in a way. And I think that this photograph here makes the color looks a little more kind of greenish yellow, but they really have kind of a warm, rich, kind of yellowish color. So again, the form itself is basically a cylinder, and a cylinder is a circle. If you think of a circle that's been pulled into space or extended into space. So it's also a basic geometric form, but it's constructed in such a way that it has these kind of organic, like irregularities to it. So again, there's that kind of balance that occurs. This is another piece around the same time period. And again, you can see how these ideas are just kind of just developing, kind of one form with another. These are also these panels that are suspended. Use fiberglass. There's fabric, like woven fabric, and then it's also embedded and kind of impregnated with this. And I think it's a combination of fiberglass and maybe latex as well. The one that's resting on the floor, you can see it has a certain amount of rigidity to it. It's almost like a panel, like in a way. But they're also translucent, so you can see through them, and they really do have this kind of skin, like a strange sort of skin-like quality. But they're essentially repetitions of squares, and the idea of weaving itself, work in a weave creates a square. And again, we think, on one hand, and it's in a really rigid form, we think of that as sort of the essence of minimalism, and these, that's the kind of repetition of, squares and cubes and so on. But when it's in fabric, then suddenly it has a whole other, literally another kind of layer to it. And with work like this, rather than being placed on the wall where it's hung, parallel or kind of flat against the wall, they're suspended so you can walk around them. You could, try to walk between them. And they also catch the air currents of the space as well, so they kind of shift. There's a kind of subtle movement to it, but that's going to depend on how many people are in the space and literally the airflow of the space as well. And then Hesse began around in the kind of really late part of the 1960s to around 1970. She began working with using manila rope, which is kind of really kind of standard kind of stuff you get at a hardware store, and dipping it in latex. And so I want to show you these two images here because this is where she's working on one of these pieces in the studio, and this is a photograph where you can kind of see them up close. And they have a really visceral quality to them. And visceral is a good word to know. Viscera refers to your viscera, which is your guts. So if you say something's visceral, and you can use visceral in a lot of different ways, but if you use the word visceral, it means gut-like is probably the best way of describing it. And so they really kind of almost have, again, this sort of organic, almost sort of intestine-like quality to them. Seeing them in the studio like this is different from how you experience them when they're installed. And this is one of her installations, probably her best known one. They're hard to photograph, I think, and this one is called Right After. And they're generally installed on very thin cables, so you don't really see. I mean, certainly you can see how they're hung, but it's really intended that the cables should kind of disappear, and so you get these again these kind of visceral type forms there. It's really web-like as well. And again, I think that it's web-like. That's an organic. It's something that has organic qualities to it. And the title of this piece is called Right After, and this is the sad part of Eva Hesse, or certainly of Eva Hesse's life, is that she was diagnosed with cancer in either 1968 or 69 with brain cancer, and this was the first sculpture she completed right after her first surgery for it, and so that's where that title comes from. And she dies really early in the 70s, like 1971 or 72, so she has a really short life. And there's some people who are concerned or have expressed their concerns that she may have developed cancer from the materials she was working with because she was using fiberglass and latex and these kind of resins. And this is in a time frame when people weren't thinking so much about the health hazards of working with those materials. So today, I think, like, if you think about studio classes, we talk about safety equipment, we use fume hoods and respirators and so on, and there's good reason, certainly for that. And we try to teach, safety practice. I hope anyway, you're getting information in your studios. And because I think that a lot of people have thought about Eva Hesse and wonder, maybe it would have happened anyway, but what if it was the materials that she was using? When I was an undergraduate, I had a professor who, when he was in graduate school, which was the early 70s, he was working with fiberglass and resin quite a bit. And he talked about how he really, in some ways, he really wished he hadn't, because he was having some health problems, and especially some liver issues that his doctors thought had to do with 20, 30 years earlier, when he was working with toxic materials without respirators. So anyway, just like a word of caution. But the thing about Hesse is that she's continued, even though she has a really short life and a pretty small body of work. She got a lot of attention pretty quickly. Her work got collected into some significant collections or museums, so people were able to see her work. And she continues to be really influential on artists today. And there's certainly, we're just kind of looking at a few pieces of her work, but if you're interested in her work, check it out. So if you're interested in ideas of repetition, especially, repetition, installation, organic forms, repetition of forms, she's certainly a really good artist to look at. And a good example of this idea of post-minimalism, and how minimalism starts one way and then kind of ends up moving in a different direction. For the rest of today, and whatever we don't get through today, I think I'll put into a form that you can look at before Monday. Because really, the artists we're going to look at under this heading of Return of the Figure, they're all the theme is very similar. The work itself is different, one to the other, but the general theme is kind of the same. And I put this under the heading of the Return of the Figure, and I put and painting, both of which never really went away. And the reason for that is, as you look at, especially when you're reading about art, or say you look at the textbook, or you're looking at the significant exhibitions for a particular time period, it seems like there's this movement away from the figure, there's a movement away from naturalism, and there's a movement away from painting. And also, too, when you look at the articles that are being written about over time, it seems like about every 10 years or so, there's some big article that says painting is dead, or narrative painting is dead, or the figure is dead, or something like that. And then right after that, there's another article saying, no, it isn't. Look at all these artists who are working either with painting or with the figure and so on. And I think the reason for that is because painting, especially painting itself as a media plus narrative painting and figurative painting, exists over such a long period of time. When we think about the history of art, going back to ancient times, and you can take it back into prehistoric times, if you want to. And then all of a sudden, when you get into the 20th century, there's so many changes to that. Certainly the development of abstraction in the early part of the century, and then when you get to abstract expressionism, this movement away from the figure, although painting is big. And then as you get in the 1960s, art seems to be about everything except painting, in some ways. But it's still there. It's still there. And I think that painting, narrative painting, and figurative painting, in a way will always sort of be like the standard, or the benchmark, in a way, that other variations or other iterations of art will tend to kind of bounce off of, or be compared to. Maybe is another way of thinking about it. So, but as you might expect, when we look at painting, we look at the figure, it comes back in a new way, in a different way. So it's not just that these old ideas and these old forms continue. You don't necessarily see academic painters, continuing to paint in the way they did in the 19th century. But we'll see references to them, certainly, in a number of ways. This is an early work by Chuck Close, who I think a lot of people are familiar with. Does everybody here know Chuck Close pretty much? He's just one of those phenomenal, kind of superstar artists. He's had a really long career. He's got a huge body of work. But when you look at his work, it pretty much exists into two categories. So one is the category before he had an illness that left him partially paralyzed, and then it's post situation, or kind of post, I think the right word to say that, but there's I don't know. I think we'll just leave it at that. So we'll start with the early form here. When Close first starts painting, keep in mind it's the late 1960s. Painting in a in a very naturalistic way is not popular. right? So it's certainly not what's going to be emphasized. Certainly in art school, there might actually be a lot of push, against students to move away from that. And if you wanted to paint in that way, you have to do something different, and you've also got to be able to conceptualize it as well. You've got to have an idea behind it. You can't just be painting things in a naturalistic way. You can't be just painting, for painting's sake. It's got to have it's got to have some kind of concept behind it. So close in upon this idea, and there's a lot of things kind of coming into this work here. This is a self-portrait they did. I think this photograph was in the studio as opposed to being in the first exhibition. And he became really interested in this idea of how artists create paintings, artists create photographs, and what happens if you create paintings from photographs. And so what we're looking at here is an image which he's created using a photograph as the source work. And he's also, the other thing he was doing too is being very conscientious about scale. So he's working in a format here which is basically an 8 by 10. And, which is, especially for the time period in the 60s, an 8 by 10 is pretty standard for portrait photography as well. So it's like this up-close, photograph. And as a painter, if you were, in terms of using a photograph as a source material, if he wanted to, he could make it not look like a photo. But instead he does the opposite. He paints it in such a way that he really draws attention to the fact that the source is a photograph, not the person sitting there, or in a sense, looking at himself in the mirror, since it's a self-portrait. So he's not looking, directly in that way. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see it has to do with depth of field. So, and he even talked about this too in various interviews, where he was using a tape measure to set the camera and sitting in front of the camera, and taking the photograph using a cable release. And the way he has the camera set, this area here, particularly like the cigarette in his mouth and his nose, and the front of the glass of the lenses in his glasses, these are all sort of in super focus. But then if you look carefully, his hair here and even part of his neck is out of focus. So what's on this kind of front plane is in focus, just a few inches back is out of focus. So as an artist, you could have made that decision to paint everything intense in an intensely clear way. But he doesn't, because he wanted people to look at this painting and be thinking about photography, which I think is sort of an interesting idea. And the scale of it was also important too, because it's a little kind of off-putting in some ways. And you also have to think about this too within the context of the time, because today we can print really large relatively inexpensively, whether it's photographic prints or if you're working today on big large format printers. In 1968, it's very difficult, well, it's probably kind of impossible actually, to print a photograph on this scale. So in the late 60s, if you wanted a billboard, you'd hire somebody to paint it, or you'd print it in smaller sections and paste it together. And that's the kind of thing you'd see that in commercial advertising. So for us to think about blowing images up today, I think we're really comfortable with that, and that's sort of common to us, but it wasn't in the past. You see a big painting, but an image of a person up close, and then has kind of photographic elements to it were really kind of strange. The other thing too is that this photograph is in black and white, and the painting is also in black and white as well. And so he's doing that intentionally. So you're looking at a painting, but you're thinking about photography. So he's sort of kind of literally playing with that. And then also through the early 70s, he does a number of paintings in a very similar way. This one is Linda, and then he begins to shift toward color. So he starts with black and white and goes toward color. Most of these are oil paintings. There are also some watercolor paintings as well. Unless you see them in person, if you see them in reproduction, it can be really difficult to tell one from the other, but when you see them in person, it's more obvious. And the watercolor paintings are usually on a smaller scale as well. And you can also see that here when you look in some areas, like around her eyes, or her mouth, or her hair in some places, really super clear and super focused. But then the fabric in her collar here begins to be a little bit softer. You're allergic to this stuff. And then again, that's this playing with this idea that you're thinking about painting and thinking about photography and thinking about how we make images, especially within the context of this time period. I should explain this term, superrealism. Superrealism is a term that's used with a number of artists who were all beginning to work in the early 1970s. And even though Close's style changes very dramatically, he still tends to be referred to as a super realist artist, or sometimes even just a realist artist. But the change in this work has to do with physical limitations. So what happened was in the late 80s, I want to say it was like 87 or 88, and I don't know what I'm not sure what happened, whether it was an accident or just one of those things that happens and there's really no reason for it. But he had a blood clot near his spine, or that was kind of close to his spine. And so when he really almost died from it, the end result, the damage that was done to his spine, it was either his spinal cord or, well, the same thing, spinal cord, central nervous system, left him partially paralyzed. He could still walk, but not for very long. I'm not sure that he's really able to walk these days. He still had use of his hands, but it was limited. But he didn't stop painting, and so that's, I think, that's one of the things I think that people have always been so impressed by Chet Close, and that in some ways he continues to do the same thing but do it differently. And when he's talked about his work, one of the things he talks about is that when it in some ways it almost sort of forced him to become a little bit more honest about the way that he was making the images. Because, and this is an example here, this is a study, he's doing a value study basically for a painting that he was going to do in color. And what you see here is he's taken the image and he's gridded it out, right? And that's exactly how he was working when he was creating the super realist paintings. He was taking the photographs, gridding out the images, then creating the paintings where he's painting each square essentially to keep everything into perspective and keep it kind of photo accurate in that respect. But in those earlier works, he wasn't allowing you to see the grid. So the grid's there, but he's kind of erasing it as he was working. And so what changes in his work is he allows you to continue to see the grid. And I think this is certainly a good example. I think I've got, an image of here. This is him in the studios in the 90s. And so this is a little bit later portrait, actually. So here he is seated here. He's got his source photograph here, and you can't see the grid marks on it, but he's got a layer of mylar or something, or kind of plastic over the surface of it that's gridded. And he's basically working section by section. And you can see where he's built up some areas here. Others are really in their very, very basic form. And as a painter, he really understands color very well. And so, for example, we can look at this portrait here of Lucas Samaras, who's also an artist. He does installation art and photography, or he's known for that. And then this is a super close-up detail part of the painting. And this is a pretty big painting. But when you look closely, you can see that the grid remains there. You can see the way that he's using color, and he really has to pre-plan everything. He's a very, very organized artist. I mean, I think he's always been a very organized artist. And I think especially as the style had to change, that's reflective of his physical limitations, he probably has to pre-plan even more. So I've always found that I like his later work better. I mean, in a crazy sort of way. And I think maybe it's sort of inspiring in a way too. Something that for some people might have ended their career, he turns it into a positive. He takes his limitations and turns it in my view, his limitations led to better art in some ways. But again, that's a personal bias. You might argue the other. Yeah.
What's really interesting is that how he changed his style still follows his general idea of how he presents his art not only as a painting or something, but also as photography.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you blow up an image, you get that effect, that pixelated sort of blocked out color effects that end up creating a really detailed image, and that's basically all he's doing is he's just emphasizing extra on that.
Yeah, and you would get that if it's film, you'd get grain. If it's something digital, you would get that kind of pixelation. And the interesting thing too is I think we think about pixels today, those little squares, because that's sort of the building blocks of digital images. But when he's starting to do this, digital imagery really doesn't exist yet, or it's really in its very, very foundational stages. So and I think that in itself is kind of an interesting idea. Which comes first, right? The digital image or the concept, I guess the concept has to come first in some some ways. But you can look at art like this, and you can kind of see the direction, that the imagery is going to go in this newer kind of digital age. Now, the next artist is Richard Estes, and he's really the classic super realist painter in a lot of ways. This is a painting they did in 1972. A title that's called Bus Reflection, and the color of this is a little warm. It should be a much kind of brighter kind of white light. So I'll just draw attention. It's not quite perfect. And Estes becomes known in particular for paintings like this, where there are images of street scenes, city scenes. So there's lots of buildings, cars, especially lots of reflective surfaces. So he oftentimes orients his paintings, or the imagery in his paintings, there's some glass, so you're seeing through the glass, but you're seeing the reflections on the glass at the same time. And I think Estes is a good example in terms of talking about the word superrealism too, because he's creating an image that seems so realistic that it's almost unrealistic in some ways, which I think is very intriguing. And so as you look, and I think a lot of times people respond to these paintings and they go, ooh, wow, and they think about technical proficiency and everything. Estes, like Close, is also using photographs, which I think is kind of obvious, using photos as source materials. But as you look at it, do you think it's really realistic, or is it so real that it's unreal?
It's almost like a movie scene.
Yeah, and why a movie scene?
I think the saturation and just the setup of it, it's really kind of perfectly balanced. You have this high level of symmetry to it that kind of juxtaposes itself to this really naturalistic setting. So it seems like it's really, really planned out.
And maybe it's got this really intense one-point perspective that makes you feel like you're pulled into it, and like cinema, you can be moving through the space.
I'm thinking it's more like, because there is no, everything is in focus.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you're in that situation, you were just standing there, the wall, if you were looking at the building, the wall would be out of focus.
Yeah.
Or but when you watch a movie, everything is in focus.
Unless the director's maybe point not to do that. They were trying to do. A lot of times the focus is where they want to draw your attention to, and kind of ignore everything else a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Good question. We rarely. I can't think of. Well, maybe never actually. I can't think of any paintings that have people in them. Yeah. So that once you realize that, I think there's one thing you go, well, wait a minute. This seems to be a busy city. There's obviously there's a taxi cab and a bus, so there ought to be people, but it's devoid of people, so it's a little strange in that way. What about the reflections? Are the reflections possible?
Probably exaggerated. You're not seeing what's behind the glass.
Yeah, exactly, right? So if you look carefully here, we see the bus here and the taxi's up here. But the way the reflection is here, it seems like the bus should actually be over here somewhere, probably, and you wouldn't be able to see the taxi, right? So once you realize that, you realize that the artist has made changes to it. It's not necessarily representing a real, sort of real moment in time. And why would he do that?
It gives it this mirror effect.
Yeah,
it lines up.
Yeah, it makes it symmetrical, right? So you've got this balance of forms. There's a center line here. You've got the curve in it. These are orthogonals. I think this is single point perspective. And the patterns that you see here are then reflected on the other side. So he's making the image, even though it's open space and buildings here and a flat surface here, he's creating this very kind of symmetrical sort of balance. So which I think is really interesting, because a lot of times when people look at these images, they respond to the intense realism, of them, and a lot of times they fail to really spend the time to realize, wait a minute, things aren't necessarily adding up, and I think that's an interesting part of Estes' work.
The thing that doesn't make the most sense to me about the reflection of the buildings in the background, because the buildings are so far in the background you would never see them in the glass that's way back here compared to them.
Yeah, and these buildings are here, and these buildings are up there, right? It's impossible. So, and this is where this idea of super real comes in. It's impossible to see this reflection if you were really on the street, looking at the image.
An idealized sense of what we think
Yeah.
perceptions of reality are, how we think we're perceiving reality, but in reality, your eyes does not optimally.
Yeah, it's a very different thing.
It's like
And I don't think I've ever been in a city that's this clean. Too. It looks like everything's been power washed and kind of buffed, to a shine. One of the things about superrealism is it kind of hit the scene, and there was a lot of buzz about it really early in the 1970s. But a lot of artists who are working in a super realist vein, their style doesn't change very much over time. So, for example, we've got Richard Estes here in 1972. We can look at another painting by him in 1984, and it's not a whole lot different, from that earlier painting. One of the things that happens with a number of the super realist painters is that there's a lot, and you can kind of see this happen in the literature, is there was a lot of buzz in the early 70s about this new style and the return of painting and the return of the real and all of these issues. And then it's kind of on to the next thing in some ways. And museums and tended to there's collected the work, but generally not particularly heavily. But superrealism became really popular with collectors, and so the paintings tend to have a lot of market value. And that even that in itself has been discussed, that people have individually have responded to this work or to superrealist work and continued to make it popular at a certain level. But you tend to not see as much critical information about it in terms of being written about in art, magazines or again also being continued to be collected in museums. And the kind of criticism of superrealism is that it's a little bit of a one-trick pony in a way. It's repeating itself. There's kind of, and it's sort of interesting. Too much repetition of sameness. There are also some super real artists who are also doing something similar but also different, and I think Audrey Flack is a good example of this. But in addition to creating images that are intensely naturalistic, intensely realistic, such as we see here, she's also referencing past traditions. And technically, as we think about the timeline, it's in the 1970s that people are beginning to talk about this idea of postmodernism. And generally, Audrey Flack is not talked about as too much as a postmodernist, but she should be, I think, because what she's doing is, one of the things she's doing is a kind of postmodern strategy. And so to talk about postmodernism is first to talk about modernism. So one of the things about modernism, or one of the characteristics of modernism, is that artists are constantly seeking the new. So this is an expectation that modern artists are always trying to push the barriers further, right? There's this idea that modern art and avant-gardism go hand in hand, and to be an avant-garde artist means you're pushing the boundaries, you're pushing the envelope, you're trying to, it sounds like Star Trek or something, like you're trying to, seek out new, frontiers and so on, right? And so that's what modernist artists do. As we come into a postmodern time frame, there's this idea that it's okay to reflect the past. Some people see it as a negative thing, like, oh my God, we've done everything, now where do we go from here? But more often than not, artists saw it as freeing them up, that they could reflect the past, they could reflect on past traditions, because it was always with the understanding that whatever you do, it's still reflective of your time. Because what we're looking at here is a kind of painting which is basically a vanitas painting, right? So you can get a Dutch 17th century painting. It's a still life, it's an arrangement of objects that in various ways are all about the transience of life. So, and a lot of these are, even though they're updated, they're very standard symbols of transience, like a mirror. It's all about the kind of superficial surfaces of things, candle burning, fruit, a line here, the skull, certainly. What else? A calendar. I mean, that's pretty, certainly really obvious. There's references, to cosmetics, as well as a little powder puff thing and lipstick and so on. So again, surface beauty, it's all, eventually going to fade at some point. But Flack is doing it in a way here that's totally different from 17th century, Dutch painting. Part of it has to do with the point of view that everything's really kind of compressed. It's almost claustrophobic instead of being arranged out on a table. And the other thing has to do with this, also with the scale of the painting. And she's doing this knowingly as well. This painting is actually significantly bigger than we see it here. So I think it's more like maybe 6 or 8 feet high or so it's got a significant scale. Vanitas painting in the 17th century, it's always relatively small. so Vanitas paintings generally are not particularly good. So she's playing with, kind of making these references to the past, but updating it into her own time. And she's also making certainly references to herself. The little photograph that you see here is the source photo. Is John painting versus the photo is an image of herself. So she's bringing that into play as well. So through the late 70s and 80s, she's working primarily as a painter. And then in the late 80s, she begins to shift directions and work as a sculptor, creating what we're seeing here is a relatively small sculpture. It's about maybe 15 inches or so in height. But she also does, and we'll look at some examples, she also worked on some public commissions as well and worked on a really large scale. And this is also a good example of a more postmodern, kind of attitude. So what she's done here, she's got this title. It's called the Egyptian Rocket Goddess. The figure itself looks like 19th century academic style sculpture. It's very naturalistic. It's a bronze, that's been treated with a patina. The fact that she's making allusions to the Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut in particular, or that it's Egyptian at all, or there's these references, to Egypt, takes this, again, there's this reflection back to ancient times. And then if you look carefully, some of the details, you can see on the top of the headdress here, and then at the kilt where it's wrapped around, what's normally would be an icon of Horus now looks like a jet airplane, right, or a kind of rocket. Actually, it's a rocket here, and it's a jet fighter up above. So what she's done here, she's kind of mixed all of these things together. 19th century academic style sculpture references, back to ancient Egypt and ancient art, and then these very kind of contemporary kind of issues. So everything gets layered together. She also, around this time period, worked on, I thought I had these images in here. And we're just about out of time. I'll tell you what, what I'm going to do is put this information either on Canvas or the blog. Check Canvas first. I'll give you information about Dwayne Hansen and his work, which is very interesting. But I'll also show you some images of public art projects that, I'll jump back here, that Flack worked on. It's in North Carolina.